anniversary for our country. Through his faith, his courage, and his wisdom, Dr. Martin Luther King moved an entire nation. He preached the gospel of brotherhood, of equality, and justice. That's the cause for which he lived and for which he died 40 years ago today. And so before we begin, I ask you to join me in a moment of silence in memory of this extraordinary American. I had the opportunity to speak to Dr. King's family this morning, Martin Luther King III. They are in Memphis today, honoring Dr. King's life and death. There's been a lot of discussion this week about how Dr. King's life and legacy speaks to us today. It's taking place in our schools, in our churches, on television, and around the dinner table. And I suspect that much of what folks are talking about centers on the issue of racial justice, on the Montgomery bus boycott and the March on Washington, on the Freedom Rides, and the stand at Selma. And that is how it should be, because those were times when ordinary men and women, straight-backed, clear-eyed, challenged what they knew was wrong and helped perfect our union. And they did so in large part because Dr. King, like a modern-day Moses, pointed the way. But I also think it's worth reflecting on what Dr. King was doing in Memphis 40 years ago today, when he stepped onto that motel balcony on his way out for dinner. And what he was doing was standing up for struggling sanitation workers. For years, those workers had served their city without complaint, picking up other people's trash for little pay and even less respect. Passers-by would call them walking buzzards. And in the segregated South, most were forced to use separate drinking fountains and separate bathrooms. But in 1968, those workers decided they'd had enough, and over 1,000 went on strike. Their demands were modest: better wages, better benefits, and recognition of their union. But the opposition was fierce. Their vigils were met with handcuffs. Their protests turned back with mace, and at the end of one march, a 16-year-old boy lay dead. This is the struggle that brought Dr. King to Memphis. It was a struggle for economic justice, for the opportunity that should be available to people of all races and from all walks of life. Because Dr. King understood that the struggle for economic justice and the struggle for racial justice were really one, that each was a part of a larger struggle for freedom, for dignity, and for humanity. So long as Americans were trapped in poverty, so long as they were being denied decent wages and benefits and fair treatment, so long as opportunity was being opened to some but not all, the dream that he spoke of would remain out of reach. And on the eve of this death, Dr. King gave a sermon in Memphis about what the movement meant to him and to America. And in tones that would prove eerily prophetic, Dr. King said that despite the threats that he had received, he didn't fear any man, because he had been there when Birmingham aroused this conscience of a nation. He had been there to see the students stand up for freedom by sitting at lunch counters. And he'd been there in Memphis when it was dark enough to see the stars, to see the community coming together around a common purpose. So Dr. King had been to the mountaintop. He had seen the promised land. And while he knew somewhere deep in his bones that he would not get there with us, he knew that we would get there. He knew it because he had seen that Americans have the capacity as he said that night, to project the I into the thou, to recognize that no matter what color of our skin, no matter what faith we practice, no matter how much money we have, no matter whether we are a sanitation worker or a United States senator, we all have a stake in one another. We are our brother's keeper. We are our sister's keeper. We are our brother's keeper, our sister's keeper, and I quote him, either we go up together or we go down together. And when he was killed the following day, it left a wound on the soul of our nation that is not yet fully healed. In few places was the pain more pronounced than in Indianapolis, where Robert Kennedy happened to be campaigning. And as Mike mentioned, it fell to him to inform a crowd in a park that Dr. King had been killed. Some of you heard the recordings, the shouts, the pain that were heard as Robert Kennedy made that statement. And as the shock turned into anger, Kennedy reminded them of Dr. King's compassion and his love. And on a night when cities across the nation were alight with violence, all was quiet in Indianapolis. In the dark days after Dr. King's death, Coretta Scott King pointed out the stars. She took up her husband's cause and led a march in Memphis. I had a chance to meet Coretta Scott King on several occasions, visit with her in her apartment down in Atlanta. I remember asking her how she was able to manage all those burdens, and she would explain that it's never about me. It was never about Martin. It's about God's will and God's plan for us. Coretta Scott King took up that cause and helped to lead a march in Memphis, even though she was still grieving. Those sanitation workers eventually won their contract. However, the struggle for economic justice remains an unfinished part of the King legacy, because the dream is still out of reach for too many Americans. Just this morning, it was announced that more Americans are unemployed now than at any time in years. And all across this country, families are facing rising costs, stagnant wages, and the terrible burden of losing a home. Part of the problem is that for a long time we've had a politics that's been too small for the scale of the challenges we face. This is something I spoke about a few weeks ago in a speech I gave in Philadelphia. What I said was that instead of having a politics that's living up to Dr. King's call for unity, we've had a politics that's used race to drive us apart, when all this does is feed the forces of division and distraction and stop us from solving our problems. That is why the great need of this hour is much the same as it was when Dr. King delivered his sermon in Memphis. We have to recognize that while we each have a different past, we all share the same hopes for the future. We all hope we can find a job that pays a decent wage, that there will be affordable health care when we get sick, that we'll be able to send our kids to college, that after a lifetime of hard work, we'll be able to retire with security. There are common hopes, modest dreams, and they're at the heart of the struggle for freedom and dignity and humanity that Dr. King began, and that is our task to complete. You know, Dr. King once said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. It bends towards justice. But here's the thing. It does not bend on its own. It bends because each of us in our own ways put our hand on that arc and we bend it in the direction of justice. Because we organize and we mobilize, we march, we vote, we parent, we're active in our community, we're active in our schools. So on this day of all days, let us each do our part to bend that arc. Let's bend it towards justice. Let's bend that arc towards opportunity. Let's bend that arc towards prosperity for all. And if we can do that and march together as one nation and one people, then we won't just be keeping faith with Dr. King's dream, all that he lived and died for. We'll be making real the words of Amos that he evoked so often and said, "Let justice roll down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream." Thank you very much, Fort Wayne. Thank you. Thank you.